What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're taking a look at a clip from The Line. If you will, please go down below and make sure you follow The Line to catch more of my appearances when I host over there. Today, we're taking a call from Jeremiah, who wants to talk about the historical nature of Jesus. As you all know, I'm very passionate about this topic, so I was very excited to take Jeremiah's call. We start off discussing the historical nature of Jesus, like what evidence do we have to establish that Jesus was a historical figure? And then we move more into the prophetic sort of argument for Jesus's existence, saying that the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, has a number of prophecies that supposedly prophesy that Jesus would come. And then finally, we get into a discussion on the crucifixion and whether or not the Romans were involved in that. So if you want to fuck around and find out how we don't have enough evidence to say that Jesus actually existed in history, nor whether or not he was crucified by the Romans, then please stay tuned.
Jeremiah from Texas, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Welcome. What's on your mind?
All right, so before I get into what I want to talk about, I just want to make sure I'm barking up the right tree. John, you say you are a mythicist, correct?
I do.
And by mythicist, you do mean that there was no real guy who inspired the Gospels, correct?
Well, so yeah, I mean, I don't believe that there was a historical Jesus in history. I lean towards him being completely mythical.
Okay then. So may I have a minute to explain why I do not believe that?
Jeremiah, back off your phone just a couple of inches. You're distorting a little bit. But yeah, tell us what you're thinking.
I apologize. Okay,
No
let me
worries.
back up a bit. All right, so what I'm thinking is the Gospels are mostly myth, that I do agree with. However, there's an interesting little conundrum there because they're trying to fit Jesus into these Old Testament prophecies, especially the ones that say the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, but they have to twist themselves into pretzels to do it because he also needs to be from Nazareth. Now, my thought is...
No, well, can you explain that for me? Sorry, I'm sorry. I know that you're trying to explain right now, but I guess I reject a couple of these premises. I think that the Gospels, there's no way to determine what is or isn't mythical and historical in them. From what I can tell, most, if not all, of the basic facts that are presented in the Gospels, they're all mythically based. So they're legendary. They're just made up stories about Jesus, or made up facts about Jesus, for one. For two, it's interesting that you say that Jesus needs to be from both places. In fact, if we look at the original gospel, which is the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is called a Nazarene, and not that he's from Nazareth, but it's a kind of a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation from the Old Testament that he needs to be from Nazareth because of the branch of Jesse and everything like that. In fact, there's actually a better argument to be made.
Not where I was going with it, but
I understand, but I mean, you're saying a few things, and so I just wanted to sort of get ahead of some of these things. In fact, the Gospel of Mark seems to indicate that Jesus, at least the Jesus depicted in Mark, more than likely came from Capernaum and not like Nazareth or Bethlehem. Bethlehem doesn't come into the picture until much later in the gospel timeline. So, I mean, but go ahead. Why do you think it was based on a real person?
I mean, my idea is that if Jesus was from Nazareth, and if I recall correctly, there is some archaeological precedent for that having been a place, or from Galilee in general, which is, I think, the wider region. My point is that why would the Gospels twist themselves into pretzels to try to make him from Bethlehem, at least the ones that go that route, if there wasn't a guy? Why would the authors put themselves in that position instead of just filling the prophecy? It'd be so much easier if there was no guy.
Right. Okay. So this is the Hitchens response to mythicism, I guess. So basically, what you have is these first century Jewish Christians. They were scrounging the Hebrew Bible, like the Septuagint, for prophecies about the Messiah. And so what they were doing was they were creating pesherums where they would reinterpret Old Testament scriptures and create this new information about the Messiah, because they thought that God was giving giving them the secret information that was encoded into the Old Testament, or the Septuagint at the time. And so they were, reinterpreting these things. And so they basically reinterpreted a few things that, they had to twist into getting some kind of idea about. And so, like the Nazareth and the Bethlehem thing is an example. They got the Nazareth thing from the root of Jesse. I can't remember which one that is, but then there's Bethlehem, which seems to, go back to another passage that claims that, that Jesus would be from the birthplace of David, or David's hometown and everything, right? And so what you have are these Jewish rabbis that were eventually going to, be Christians. They were just reinterpreting these Old Testament passages to be about Jesus when it wasn't originally about Jesus at all. They had to actually twist the information into it. And this also coincides with Paul's writings, in that Paul never states where Jesus comes from. He never states that Jesus actually had a hometown or anything like that. So we don't actually get any kind of indication as to Jesus either walking on earth or even having a hometown to come from until Mark's gospel in between 75 CE to like just after 70 CE. That's the first indication that we get that Jesus even had a hometown.
Okay, that I can see why that would make sense to you. For me, I'm not really convinced there was or wasn't a guy. I'm kind of in the middle. It makes more sense for there to have been a scam artist working in the first century who amassed a cult following.
Right. Sorry. I just want to get to the core of the issue here. So, other than like the Hitchens argument for it, what makes you think that there was like a historical Jesus? Like, are there any like elements of fact that we know to be historical fact as part of the Jesus story past the birthplace argument?
If you look at the mundane elements of the story, specifically, like you ignore all the miracles and all of that, we know that cults can go on to found religions. The Mormons are a great example of that. We know that the Romans executed people that they viewed as subversives to the state. So, and then the mundane claims are that there was a guy who developed a cult following and then was executed by the Romans.
Well, no. There's actually no evidence that he was executed by the Romans. And
I'm not saying that specific guy was. I'm just saying that we know that the Romans executed people in that way. Not that they executed that
but Jesus wasn't a threat to the Romans. Sorry, Seth. It looks like you want to say something here.
No, not at all. I wanted Jeremiah to finish his point. I want to give him a little bit of oxygen here, and then we'll come back. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Well, I mean, that pretty much was it. It's just the mundane elements of the story, to me, seem plausible. Not saying they're necessarily historical, just plausible.
Well, I wouldn't say plausible. What I would say is possible. Like it's possible there was a guy. It's possible he was crucified by the Romans. But I feel like your argument here really heavily relies on the Gospels, in that the Gospels blame the Romans for his crucifixion. But we don't actually have any information like from Paul's works that identify the Romans specifically as being the ones that crucified him. And I do agree that the Romans would crucify or execute people that were a threat to the state or whatnot, but I don't see any evidence that Jesus was a threat to the state. What I see evidence of, as far as like the general tone of the Gospels and even the tone of Paul, is that Jesus was a threat to the Sanhedrin. And so the Sanhedrin would have been the one to actually execute Jesus in this particular fashion. You even have, passages in the Hebrew Bible where crucifixion is even prescribed, a form of persecution, not Roman persecution, obviously, but a form of crucifixion was actually prescribed for certain infringements on God's law. So it would have actually been, the Sanhedrin or the Jews to directly do this, as opposed to them pawning Jesus's crucifixion off on the Romans. So it kind of seems like none of this actually makes sense in context, especially when you consider the actual evidence that we have through Paul's epistles. So like even the mundane things, I can't actually place those in history. Sure, possible. Plausible, not when you consider all of the evidence that we have.
All right. I won't say I'm convinced that Jesus didn't exist, but I see where you're coming from, and that does make sense.
And Jeremiah, for what it's worth, I don't know either, right? I mean, there might have been a charismatic guy that the supernatural God-man Jesus character was based on. and it might have been a hybrid of previous deities or like some celestial deities or whatnot. So you and I fall in the same boat. I have no idea. I don't take a position either way. Okay.
Oh yeah,
All
and
right.
I
Yeah,
just want to specify that I don't require people to take a certain position or anything like that. I'm perfectly fine with people not being on board like I am. I guess just when people are kind of curious about it and they're wondering like why don't you think that, I tend to info dump, and so like that's kind of what happened here.
Okay.
I get it in my head
I
and I'm
get
like, oh nope, there's this thing, that thing, this thing, and so it just sort of careens.
I think
That's
these are
where,
interesting conversations,
yeah.
whether they're academic or not. I think if we know the God man Jesus didn't exist, but where the Jesus character originated, I mean, these are fascinating conversations and I think worthy ones. Any final thoughts, Jeremiah? Didn't mean to interrupt you, brother.
Oh no, that was everything. I really just kind of wanted to prod at the mythicism, kind of get more clarity on where that's coming from, and I think I have. So I appreciate your time. Thank you both. I hope you have a good rest of your show.
And Jeremiah, if I can suggest, I would definitely suggest looking into mystery cults in the first century BCE and first century CE, and how those mystery cults seem to coincide with a lot of the things that are taught about Jesus. I would look into that specifically.
Let me write that
Thanks for
down
calling,
real
man.
quick. Have a good day.
See you later. It's funny, there's a documentary that's very problematic, came out 10, 12 years ago called Zeitgeist. And it made a bunch of parallels between Christ. Bill Maher fell into this trap with Religulous because he quoted, I think, from Zeitgeist about the Jesus and the Horus correlations, which are very sketchy. And yet there are a lot of pre-Jesus deities that had the same characteristics of Christ. Like I think it was Inanna, the Egyptian goddess who was crucified. I think it was Perseus. There's another deity that had a virgin birth, with a deity for a dad and a human mother. And, we do find a lot of interesting parallels. We find a different Jesus written about in each of the four gospels. They act differently. They were born differently. They died differently. They had different characteristics. One was more human and the other was more of a God figure. And it's interesting because when I was in the faith, they never taught us to read these things side by side. We always read the Gospels one at a time and we never compared them side by side. It was like Genesis 1 and 2. We never saw the creation story and thought, hey, wait a minute. These two different accounts are in different orders and they say different things. It's a totally different story. We just never did that. And then you feel stupid when you get older and you realize, hey, wait, it was right in front of me in black and white. I don't know if there was a real Jesus or not, but I think your point is a salient one. If I was to write a headline today about something that was foretold, but I had a 100-year-old newspaper making the prediction before I write my version of the story, right? Well, that's pretty convenient. So the New Testament authors have all of these older texts, and they're like, you know what? Let's conveniently make it so all the dots get connected in this supernatural way. I find the prophecy arguments are pretty unimpressive.
All right, heathens. You can tell I'm very passionate about this topic, and so I was very excited to answer all of these questions from Jeremiah today. But I am more interested in what you think about this discussion. What do you think about the historical nature of Jesus? Do you think he existed or do you not? What do you think about the evidence that's usually used to support his existence? And then finally, how do you feel about the prophetic argument? This idea that there are prophecies in the Hebrew Bible that say, oh, Jesus is supposed to come and here he is. And then finally, what do you think about the crucifixion? Do you think that the Romans were involved? Do you think that we have any evidence of that? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. And while you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.